The moonlight cast long shadows behind Martha Wilson as she dug frantically at the hard earth behind her small cabin. Her hands, once soft from her previous life back east, were now calloused and strong from 2 years of surviving alone in the Wyoming Territory. The Colt revolver felt heavy in her apron pocket, still warm from being fired less than an hour before. Martha's breathing came in short, panicked bursts as she clawed at the dirt with a small garden shovel, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds at the dark tree line that surrounded her homestead. The year was 1878, and for a widow living alone on the edge of civilization, justice and survival were often the same thing. She had to bury the evidence quickly. Sheriff Mills might be reasonable, but he still represented the law, and Martha knew what happened to women who took matters into their own hands in these parts. The hole was finally deep enough. Martha pulled the weapon from her pocket, taking one last look at the revolver that had belonged to her late husband. James had taught her to shoot shortly after they'd arrived from Boston, insisting that a woman alone needed to protect herself while he was away on cattle drives. "Out here, Marty," he'd said with that gentle smile of his, "a gun ain't just a tool, it's your right to stay alive." She closed her eyes briefly, remembering the weight of his hand steadying her aim. Now James was 3 years dead from typhoid, and the gun had finally served its purpose. Martha placed the weapon in the hole and quickly covered it with dirt, tamping down the soil and spreading dead leaves over the freshly disturbed earth. By morning, no one would know what lay beneath. Hey there! Thanks for watching this story. If you're enjoying it so far, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'm curious, what city are you watching from today? Martha's cabin sat on the eastern edge of Promise Creek, a small but growing settlement that had sprung up around a silver mine and cattle trading post. It wasn't much, a single street with a general store, saloon, blacksmith, and the sheriff's office. But it was civilization in a land where such things were precious. Martha kept to herself mostly, earning a modest living by selling eggs, butter, and occasionally taking in mending for the few respectable families in town. The solitary life suited her after the pain of losing James, though the loneliness sometimes clawed at her during the long winter nights. She had declined 3 marriage proposals since becoming a widow, 2 from desperate homesteaders seeking a partner to share the burden of frontier life, and 1 from Emmett Porter, the owner of the general store, who had wanted Martha since the day she'd arrived in town. As she made her way back to the cabin, Martha's hands trembled as she rinsed them in the water basin on her porch. Blood, not hers, had dried under her fingernails and in the creases of her palms. She scrubbed harder, letting the cool water calm her nerves as she replayed the events of the evening in her mind. Randall Tate had appeared at her door just after sunset, drunk and demanding payment on a debt he claimed James had owed him from a card game years ago. Martha knew it was a lie. James rarely drank and never gambled, but Tate had been persistent, his massive frame blocking her doorway, alcohol fuming from his breath as he leaned closer. "A woman alone has ways to pay," he had slurred, reaching for her waist. She had backed away, reaching for the gun hidden on the shelf behind her. The first shot had missed, splintering the doorframe. The second had not. Martha slept fitfully that night, startling awake at every sound that whistled through the cracks in her cabin walls. By morning, she had convinced herself that no one had heard the shots. Her nearest neighbor was over a mile away, and the cabin sat in a small hollow that muffled sounds. She rose with the dawn, as was her habit, and set about her chores with deliberate calm. The chickens needed feeding, water needed drawing from the well, and bread needed baking if she was to make her weekly trip into Promise Creek for supplies tomorrow. Ordinary tasks anchored her to reality, kept the panic at bay. By midday, with no sign of the sheriff or curious neighbors, Martha began to believe she might have gotten away with it. Tate had been a drifter, after all, with few friends and many enemies. It might be days before anyone noticed his absence. The sound of approaching hoofbeats froze Martha in place as she hung laundry on the line behind her cabin. A rider was coming up the narrow trail that led to her property, not from the direction of town, but from the west, along the seldom-used hunting path that skirted the edge of Blackwood Forest. She quickly wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the front of the cabin, one hand instinctively reaching for the gun that was no longer at her waist, but buried in the earth nearby. The rider came into view, a tall man on a chestnut mare, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He was a stranger. Martha knew every face in Promise Creek and most of the surrounding homesteads, and this man belonged to none of them. As he drew closer, she could see he wore no badge, which eased her fear somewhat, though a stranger could mean a different kind of trouble. "Afternoon, ma'am," the man called, pulling his horse to a stop a respectful distance from her porch. His voice carried a hint of a southern drawl, smooth as creek water over stones. "Apologize for the intrusion. Name's Ethan Blackwood. My horse threw a shoe about 2 miles back, and I've been walking her slow, hoping to find a place to rest before heading into town." He removed his hat, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind, with eyes the color of faded denim. Martha judged him to be in his mid-40s, with streaks of gray at his temples and lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled. There was something in the way he carried himself, a wariness, a readiness, that told Martha this man was no ordinary traveler. His coat was dusty from the trail, but the gun belt at his waist was well maintained, the holster worn with use. Martha hesitated before responding. A woman alone had to be careful, especially now with what lay buried behind her cabin. But the code of the West was clear. No one turned away a traveler in need. Not with the next settlement a half-day's ride and nightfall approaching. "Well, water's there if your horse needs it," she said finally, gesturing to the wooden trough near the barn. "Town's another hour's ride east, but Tom Wheeler runs the livery there. He'll fix your horse right up." She didn't invite him closer, didn't offer food or coffee as she might have done before last night. Something about the man's careful appraisal of her property made her uneasy, as if he were taking stock of every detail. Or perhaps it was just her guilty conscience, seeing threats where none existed. "Much obliged," Ethan replied, leading his horse to the water trough. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to hard country, his spurs jingling softly with each step. "Been on the trail 3 days from Laramie. Heard Promise Creek was looking for experienced men for a cattle drive south." He stroked his horse's neck as she drank, his eyes never quite leaving Martha. "You run this place alone, ma'am? Seems a fair bit of work for one person." There was no impropriety in his tone, just casual conversation, but Martha felt the question probe at her vulnerability. Women didn't often hold property alone out here. They were wives, daughters, sisters, always defined by their relation to a man who offered protection in this harsh land. "My husband built this place," Martha replied, her chin lifting slightly. "Been managing fine since he passed." She didn't elaborate further, didn't mention how she'd fought the bank's attempts to claim the property, or how she'd learned to shoot, hunt, and repair every inch of the small homestead through trial and bitter error. The first year alone had nearly broken her, but Martha Wilson wasn't one to be easily defeated. She'd earned every splinter and callus, every small victory against the elements and the loneliness. The stranger, Ethan, nodded as if he understood more than she'd said, and something in his expression softened. He had the look of someone who recognized struggle and respected those who endured it. As Ethan tended to his horse, Martha noticed him glancing toward the rear of the cabin, his eyes lingering on the spot where she had buried the gun just hours before. Her heart quickened. Though she told herself there was nothing to see, she had been careful, had scattered leaves and branches over the disturbed earth. But there was something in the way the stranger's gaze returned to that spot that sent a chill through her. "Planning to stay long in Promise Creek?" she asked, trying to reclaim his attention, to draw his eyes away from the evidence of her crime. The question came out sharper than she'd intended, almost suspicious, and she saw Ethan's eyebrow raise slightly at her tone. "That depends on the work," he replied easily, though his eyes narrowed slightly as they returned to her face. "And the welcome. Some towns are friendlier than others to men with my background." He didn't elaborate on what that background might be, but the way his hand rested near his holster told its own story. Martha had seen enough men like him pass through, skilled with a gun, carrying shadows they never named, looking for a place where the past couldn't find them. In another life, she might have been curious, might have invited him to stay for supper and drawn out his story over coffee. But not today, not with Randall Tate's blood still fresh in her memory and the Colt revolver buried where this stranger's eyes kept drifting. The sun was beginning its descent behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in streaks of amber and gold, when Ethan finally made to leave. He had tightened his saddle, checked his horse's injured hoof one last time, and turned to Martha with that same measured gaze that seemed to see more than she wished to reveal. "I thank you for the water and the rest," he said, settling his hat back on his head. "If you don't mind my saying, Mrs." He paused, waiting for her to supply her name. Martha hesitated, then relented. If he was heading into town, he'd learn it anyway. Promise Creek was too small for anonymity. "Wilson," she provided, staying firmly on her porch. "Martha Wilson." Ethan nodded, continuing his thought. "Mrs. Wilson, a place this remote should have better protection. Your rear property line's entirely exposed to the forest, and that back window has a broken latch." His tone was matter-of-fact, not condescending, but Martha felt a flare of indignation nonetheless. She didn't need another man telling her what her home lacked, especially not a stranger who'd been scrutinizing her property with too keen an interest. Before she could respond, he added, "These hills have been seeing more traffic lately. Men coming through who don't much care for boundaries or propriety. Just an observation from someone who's seen trouble find the unprepared." Martha stiffened, wondering if his words held a deeper meaning. Did he know something about Tate? Had he seen something during his brief stay? She forced herself to respond calmly. "I appreciate the concern, Mr. Blackwood, but I've managed just fine on my own." She didn't mention the gun buried out back, didn't speak of how she'd already faced exactly the kind of trouble he was warning about, and had dealt with it in the only way available to her. Instead, she simply added, "Promise Creek's a small place. Sheriff Mills keeps good order." The mention of the law was deliberate, a subtle reminder that whatever he might think he knew, the town had authority that would stand behind one of its own. Ethan mounted his horse with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. "Sheriff Mills," he repeated, as if testing the name. "Good to know. I'll make his acquaintance when I get to town." He tipped his hat to Martha, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of its brim. "Good evening to you, Mrs. Wilson. Perhaps our paths will cross again." With that, He turned his horse toward the trail that led east to Promise Creek, but not before casting one last, lingering look at the disturbed earth behind Martha's cabin. She stood motionless on the porch until horse and rider disappeared around the bend, then released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Sleep eluded Martha that night, her mind racing with possibilities, none of them comforting. If the stranger, Ethan Blackwood, had noticed something amiss behind her cabin, would he mention it to Sheriff Mills? Was he himself some kind of lawman? Perhaps a marshal, tracking Tate for crimes committed elsewhere? Or was he simply a drifter with too observant an eye and too many questions? Martha tossed in her narrow bed, the familiar creaks of her cabin now sinister in the darkness. By the time dawn broke over the eastern hills, she had made her decision. She would go into town as planned, conduct her business as usual, and gauge the situation. If there was talk about Tate, or if the stranger had raised suspicions, she would hear of it. Better to face whatever was coming than wait for it to find her. Promise Creek was already humming with activity when Martha arrived shortly after 9. Her wagon loaded with butter, eggs, and a quilt she had finished for Mrs. Gardner, the doctor's wife. She tied her horse at the hitching post outside Porter's General Store, nodding greeting to familiar faces as she made her way inside. Emmett Porter's face brightened visibly when she entered, his substantial frame moving quickly from behind the counter to greet her. "Mrs. Wilson, a pleasure as always." His voice carried the eager tone it always held for her, a constant reminder of his persistent interest despite her repeated refusals. Today, however, Martha was grateful for his attention. Emmett knew every whisper and rumor in Promise Creek. "Morning, Mr. Porter," Martha replied, setting her basket of goods on the counter. "Brought those eggs you ordered, and some fresh butter besides." She glanced around the store, noting the other customers, Miss Fletcher selecting fabric, old Mr. Simmons examining tools, 2 cowboys she recognized from the Henderson Ranch looking at tobacco. No sign of Ethan Blackwood, nor any unusual atmosphere that might suggest a body had been discovered or a murder whispered about. Emmett was already examining her eggs with appreciation, praising their size and quality as he always did. Martha let him talk, waiting for the moment to casually introduce her real questions. "Town seems busy today," she observed when Emmett paused for breath. "Any news worth hearing?" She began selecting the items she needed: coffee, flour, a new spool of thread, keeping her tone light, uninterested. Emmett was always eager to share gossip, especially with Martha, whose visits to town were infrequent enough to make her a valuable audience for accumulated news. He leaned closer across the counter, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial level that had become their routine during these exchanges. "Well, now that you mention it," Emmett began, his round face alight with the pleasure of being first to deliver information, "there's a new fellow in town. Rode in yesterday evening. Took a room at the boarding house." Martha's fingers tightened around a tin of baking powder, but she kept her expression neutral as Emmett continued. "Name of Blackwood. Says he's looking for work with the Henderson outfit, but Bill Mason over at the saloon thinks he might be a gunslinger." Emmett's voice dropped further on this last word, his eyes wide with the drama of it. "Has that look about him, you know. Careful like, watches everything." Martha set the tin in her basket with deliberate calm. "Seems an ordinary enough name. What makes Mason think he's dangerous?" She kept her tone merely curious, though her heart had begun to beat faster. Emmett straightened, pleased to have captured her interest, unaware that it stemmed from fear rather than fascination. He adjusted his spectacles with an air of authority. "Well, for one, he was asking questions about local law enforcement. Wanted to know all about Sheriff Mills, how long he's been here, whether he's effective, that sort of thing." Emmett paused, then added with a hint of pride at his insider knowledge, "And Tom Wheeler says his gun belt shows more wear than a cattleman's would. Says it's the mark of a man who draws often and fast." A chill settled in Martha's stomach. Questions about the sheriff could be innocent enough for a newcomer, but combined with the stranger's interest in her property, his noticing the disturbed earth behind her cabin, she forced herself to continue shopping, adding sugar and salt to her basket as Emmett rattled on about other town gossip. Her mind was elsewhere, calculating possibilities, planning her next move. If Blackwood suspected something and spoke to Sheriff Mills, her cabin might be searched. The gun would be found, and with it the evidence of her crime. No one would believe she had acted in self-defense, not when she had hidden the weapon and the body. She needed to retrieve the gun, perhaps move it somewhere farther from her property, or better yet, dispose of it completely in the deep pools of Blackwater River. Martha was so absorbed in these thoughts that she nearly collided with Sheriff Mills himself as she exited Porter's store, her purchases packed in her wagon. "Whoa there, Mrs. Wilson," the sheriff said, steadying her with a hand on her arm. "In quite a hurry this morning, aren't you?" At 55, John Mills was a solid presence in Promise Creek, his silver-streaked beard and weathered face as familiar as the badge he'd worn for over a decade. He had been kind to Martha after James's death, ensuring other men in town respected her privacy and her property rights. Now, she looked into his face with carefully concealed terror, searching for any sign that he knew what she had done. "Just trying to beat the heat for the ride home, Sheriff," Martha replied, managing a smile that felt brittle on her face. "How are things in town? Peaceful, I hope?" She tried to keep her voice steady, casual, though she was acutely aware of the way the sheriff studied her face. John Mills had been lawman too long not to recognize nervous behavior, and Martha silently cursed her own transparency. To her relief, the sheriff's expression remained friendly. Showing no particular suspicion or concern, he adjusted his hat against the morning sun before answering. "Quiet as can be expected, I suppose. Always something needing attention, but nothing serious lately." He paused, then added, "Though I did meet an interesting fellow at breakfast this morning. New in town, name of Blackwood. Mentioned he'd stopped at your place yesterday with a lame horse." The sheriff's tone was conversational, but Martha felt her mouth go dry. Had Blackwood said something after all? Was this Mills's way of easing into an interrogation? She forced herself to nod acknowledgement, not trusting her voice immediately. The sheriff continued, seemingly oblivious to her distress. "Seemed a decent sort. Said your well water saved his horse a good deal of discomfort. He's looking for work with the Henderson outfit." "Yes, he mentioned that," Martha replied, finding her voice at last. "Didn't stay long. Just watered his horse and moved on." She busied herself adjusting the packages in her wagon, avoiding the sheriff's eyes, praying he wouldn't ask more detailed questions about her brief encounter with Ethan Blackwood. To her immense relief, Mills merely nodded, apparently accepting her abbreviated account without suspicion. They exchanged a few more pleasantries before the sheriff continued on his morning rounds, leaving Martha trembling slightly with the effort of maintaining her composure. The ride back to her cabin seemed interminable, the familiar trail now fraught with new dangers. Every rider she glimpsed in the distance, every unusual sound from the woods beside the road sent Martha's heart racing. By the time she arrived home, the sun was high overhead, beating down on the small clearing where her cabin stood. Nothing appeared disturbed. The chickens scratched contentedly in their pen. The cabin door remained secured as she had left it. But Martha took no comfort in these ordinary sights. She unhitched her horse and cared for it mechanically, her mind fixed on one urgent task. She needed to retrieve the gun before anyone else could find it. Waiting until dusk would be safer, but Martha couldn't bear the thought of leaving the evidence buried a moment longer than necessary. Not with Ethan Blackwood in town asking questions about local law. As soon as her wagon was unloaded, she took her garden trowel and made her way to the back of the cabin, constantly scanning the tree line, the trail, the horizon for any sign of approaching visitors. The disturbed earth was exactly as she had left it, though in the harsh light of day, it seemed far more obvious than it had by moonlight. Martha knelt and began to dig, working quickly, her breath coming in short gasps as fear and exertion combined to make her lightheaded. The sound of a twig snapping in the nearby woods froze Martha in place, the trowel still clutched in her dirt-stained hand. She looked up to see Ethan Blackwood emerging from the trees, leading his horse. He had approached silently, except for that final misstep, and now stood watching her with those same penetrating blue eyes that had unsettled her the day before. Martha rose slowly to her feet, the half-dug hole at her feet damning her as surely as if she'd been caught standing over Tate's body. For a long moment, neither spoke, the only sound the gentle breeze rustling through the aspen leaves and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. "Wilson," Ethan finally greeted her, his voice as calm as if he'd come upon her tending her garden rather than unearthing evidence of a killing. He made no move toward her, keeping a respectful distance, though his eyes flickered briefly to the hole and back to her face. "I see you're busy. Perhaps this isn't the best time for a visit." There was no accusation in his tone, but Martha heard the unspoken question nonetheless. She had been caught, plain as day, and now everything depended on what this stranger intended to do with what he knew or suspected. Her mind raced through options. Deny everything, offer an explanation, beg for silence, or a darker thought surfaced. The gun was nearly unearthed. If she could reach it before he could stop her. Martha swallowed hard, forcing down the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. "Mr. Blackwood," she acknowledged, her voice steadier than she felt. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." She didn't move away from the hole, didn't try to hide what she was doing. It was too late for that. Instead, she waited, trying to read his intentions in his weathered face. Ethan tied his horse to a nearby hitching post, a deliberate action that suggested he planned to stay a while before responding. He removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair streaked with silver, a gesture that seemed almost hesitant, at odds with the confidence he had displayed previously. "I spoke with Sheriff Mills this morning," Ethan said finally, and Martha felt her heart sink. This was it then. He had reported his suspicions, and now the sheriff would arrive soon to arrest her. She wondered wildly if she could outrun them, disappear into the vast territories to the west, where law was still a distant concept. But even as these desperate thoughts flashed through her mind, Ethan continued in that same measured tone. "Interesting man. Seems to care a good deal about the people in his jurisdiction. Mentioned that a drifter named Randall Tate had been causing trouble in these parts. Said he'd had to run him out of town twice for harassing local women." Martha stared at Ethan, uncomprehending. This wasn't how an arrest began. There was no accusation in his words, just a statement of fact that hung in the air between them. When she didn't respond, Ethan took a careful step closer, still maintaining enough distance that she didn't feel threatened. Sheriff also mentioned that Tate had been asking particular questions about a widow who lived alone east of town. Seemed concerned about it. Another step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. I didn't mention seeing any sign of Tate out this way. Didn't seem my business to report on your visitors. Relief and confusion warred within Martha. Blackwood hadn't told the sheriff about his suspicions. But why? And what did he want now? Her fingers tightened around the trowel, still her only weapon with the gun half buried at her feet. "Why are you here, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked directly, abandoning pretense. "If you've something to say it plain." The words came out harder than she'd intended, edged with the desperation of a cornered animal. Ethan stopped his approach, respecting the boundary set by her tone. His expression softened slightly, showing something that might have been understanding, or perhaps something deeper that Martha couldn't quite name. "I know what it's like to do what needs doing, Mrs. Wilson," Ethan said quietly, his voice barely carrying the distance between them. "And I know what it's like to carry that weight afterward." He glanced meaningfully at the hole at her feet, then back to her face. "I'm not here to judge you or to interfere, but digging that up in broad daylight isn't wise, especially not when there's talk in town about Tate's disappearance. A man like that has friends, not decent ones, mind you, but the kind who might come looking, asking questions." He paused, then added with gentle emphasis, "And that hole you're digging is visible from the ridge trail. Anyone passing by could see what you're about." Martha's gaze darted involuntarily to the ridge he mentioned, a path that skirted the eastern edge of her property, about a quarter-mile distant. He was right. From that elevation, her actions would be clearly visible to anyone who happened to be traveling that route. She had been so focused on her immediate fear that she hadn't considered the broader dangers. She looked back at Ethan, reassessing him. If his intention was to threaten or expose her, he could have done so already. Instead, he seemed to be offering advice, warning. She couldn't be certain, but she sensed no immediate danger from him. "What would you suggest then, Mr. Blackwood?" Martha asked cautiously, still not entirely trusting his motivations but willing to hear what he had to say. "Since you seem to have given this some thought." The words held a challenge, but also an implicit acknowledgement of her situation. Ethan accepted both with a slight nod, his expression serious. He glanced toward the setting sun, then back at the half-excavated hole, calculating something in his mind before responding. "First, we finish what you started, after dark," he replied, his voice low and practical. "Then the item needs to disappear completely. Not just buried somewhere else, but gone where it can never be found or connected to you." He didn't specify what the item was, maintaining a careful distance from direct accusation or admission. "I'd suggest the abandoned mine shaft, about 3 miles west. It's flooded at the bottom, over 100 feet deep. Whatever goes down there, stays down." He paused, then added with significance, "And I'd suggest you let me help you, Mrs. Wilson. 2 sets of eyes watching for trouble are better than 1 when it comes to matters like this." Martha studied him, searching for the trap in his offer, the hidden motive that would explain why a stranger would risk involving himself in what he clearly suspected was a killing. "Why would you do that?" she asked bluntly. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Her tone softened slightly as confusion overtook suspicion. "For all you know, I could be burying stolen goods or worse. Why risk yourself for someone you just met?" It was the question that had been building since he'd emerged from the trees, the fundamental mystery that needed answering before she could decide whether to trust him or flee while she still had the chance. Ethan's gaze held hers steadily, unflinching in the face of her direct question. Something in his eyes shifted, revealing a depth of experience that Martha recognized instinctively. the look of someone who had seen too much of life's darker corners to judge others harshly for their survival. 7 years ago, he began, his voice taking on a distant quality. My sister lived alone, on a homestead not unlike this one, in Nebraska Territory. Her husband had died in the war, but she managed on her own, until a man decided that a woman alone had no right to refuse him. His jaw tightened, the only visible sign of the emotion behind his measured words. By the time I arrived for my visit, it was too late. She hadn't had what she needed to protect herself. Martha felt the weight of his story settle between them, understanding dawning. And the man? She asked quietly, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Ethan's expression hardened, his eyes momentarily reflecting a cold resolve that sent a shiver through Martha, despite the warm evening air. He met the justice he deserved, Ethan replied simply, and I've never lost a night's sleep over it. The admission hung in the air, a shared confidence that bound them in unexpected complicity. He had revealed his own past crime to balance her vulnerability, offering trust to gain trust in return. It was a gesture Martha hadn't anticipated, and it shifted something fundamental in how she viewed this stranger and his unexpected offer of help. The sun had begun to set in earnest, the shadows lengthening around them as they stood in silent assessment of each other. Finally, Martha made her decision. After dark, then, she agreed quietly, covering the half-dug hole with her foot, smoothing the dirt as best she could. I accept your help, Mr. Blackwood. She hesitated, then added with genuine feeling, and I'm sorry about your sister. Ethan acknowledged her words with a solemn nod, then suggested they move away from the site, act normally until nightfall, in case anyone should pass by. They walked together toward the cabin, an unexpected alliance formed in the shadow of shared secrets. As darkness fell over the Wyoming hills, Martha lit a single lamp in her cabin, positioning it away from the windows to give the impression she had retired early. Ethan had spent the intervening hours helping with small repairs around her property, mending a loose board on the chicken coop, securing the broken latch on her back window that he had noticed during his first visit. They worked mostly in silence, but it was a companionable one, punctuated by practical questions and brief instructions. Martha found herself growing increasingly comfortable with his presence, his capable hands and quiet efficiency a reminder of what it had been like when James was alive, when the burden of survival hadn't rested solely on her shoulders. When the moon rose, a slender crescent that provided just enough light to see by, without revealing too much to potential observers, they returned to the burial site behind the cabin. Ethan brought a small shovel from his saddlebag, evidence of his forethought that might have alarmed Martha earlier, but now seemed merely practical. I'll dig, he offered in a whisper, kneeling beside the disturbed earth. You keep watch. If anyone approaches from the trail, signal with a soft whistle. Martha nodded, moving to a position where she could observe the main approaches to the cabin, while still remaining mostly hidden in the shadows of a large pine tree. The night was quiet, except for the distant howl of coyotes and the soft scrape of metal against earth as Ethan worked. It took less than 5 minutes to unearth the Colt revolver. Martha heard Ethan's soft intake of breath as he lifted it from its shallow grave, the moonlight gleaming dully on its metal surface. He examined it briefly, his expression unreadable in the dim light, before wrapping it carefully in a bandana from his pocket. "This was your husband's?" he asked quietly, the first direct acknowledgement between them of what the buried item actually was. Martha nodded, throat tight with emotion she hadn't expected. The gun had been James's prized possession, a connection to him that she had been reluctant to part with, even after using it to end a man's life. Now it would disappear forever. Another piece of her past consigned to oblivion. "He taught me to shoot with it," she whispered back, the confession easier in darkness. "Said a woman needed protection out here." Ethan nodded his understanding, securing the wrapped weapon inside his coat. They refilled the hole quickly, Ethan taking care to make the ground appear undisturbed, scattering pine needles and small stones over the site until it blended seamlessly with the surrounding earth. When he finished, he straightened, brushing dirt from his hands as he surveyed their work with a critical eye. Satisfied, he turned to Martha, his face half illuminated by the moon, the other half lost in shadow. "We should go now, while the night's still young," Ethan murmured, glancing toward the western hills where the abandoned mine shaft waited. "It's not a difficult ride, but better done with some moonlight than none." Martha hesitated, suddenly uncertain. Going with him meant leaving her property unattended, placing even more trust in this man she barely knew. Yet the alternative, staying behind while he disposed of the evidence, the only proof of her crime, seemed equally risky. What if he decided to take the gun to Sheriff Mills after all? What if this entire offer of help had been an elaborate ruse to gain her confidence and secure the evidence needed to condemn her? Ethan seemed to read her thoughts in her expression. "You've no reason to trust me completely," he acknowledged quietly. "I understand that. If you prefer, I can tell you exactly where to find the mine, and you can go alone." He offered the wrapped bundle containing the gun, holding it out to her without hesitation. "Or we can go together, and you can see with your own eyes that it's done properly. Your choice, Mrs. Wilson." The gesture, his willingness to relinquish control of both the evidence and the situation, decided Martha. If his intention had been to betray her, he wouldn't have given her this option. She shook her head, gently pushing the bundle back toward him. "Together," she said firmly, "and please, call me Martha. Seems we're past formalities at this point." A ghost of a smile touched Ethan's lips as he nodded agreement. They moved silently to where their horses waited, already saddled and ready for the nighttime journey. As they mounted, Martha cast one last look at her cabin, at the freshly covered earth behind it, where her secret had been buried. Whatever happened next, she had committed to this course. There would be no turning back. The ride to the abandoned mine was as Ethan had described. Not difficult, but challenging enough in the dim moonlight that they proceeded cautiously, following game trails and dry creek beds to avoid leaving obvious tracks. They spoke little during the journey, both alert for any sign of other travelers or unexpected dangers. Martha found herself studying Ethan's profile as he rode slightly ahead, guiding them through the unfamiliar terrain. In the silvery moonlight, the lines of his face seemed deeper, more defined, revealing a map of experiences that had shaped him. She wondered what other stories lay behind those features. What paths had led him to Promise Creek and to her door at precisely the moment when she most needed help? The abandoned Silver Queen mine appeared suddenly before them, a dark gash in the hillside, its weathered timber supports barely visible in the night shadows. The operation had failed years before Martha arrived in the territory. Its silver veins played out too quickly to sustain profit. Now it stood as a skeletal reminder of broken fortunes, its depths flooded by underground springs that had made deeper excavation impossible. Ethan dismounted first, tying his horse to a stunted pine before helping Martha from her saddle. His hand was warm against hers, steady and reassuring in the chill night air. They approached the mine entrance cautiously, Ethan producing a small lantern from his saddlebag and lighting it with practiced efficiency. The weak glow of the lantern revealed a narrow tunnel extending about 20 feet before opening into a larger chamber where the main shaft descended into darkness. Timbers creaked ominously overhead as they made their way inside, the musty scent of damp earth and rotting wood filling Martha's nostrils. Ethan moved with the confidence of someone who had explored the place before, leading her to the edge of the main shaft, where the lantern light disappeared into seemingly bottomless darkness. The sound of dripping water echoed from far below, a hollow, ghostly rhythm that marked the flooded depths. Martha felt a shiver run through her that had nothing to do with the cool air of the mine. Ethan unwrapped the revolver, holding it briefly in the lantern light, the metal gleaming one last time before its final journey into darkness. He looked at Martha questioningly, offering her the chance for a final goodbye to this piece of her past. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing the weapon's grip, memories flooding back. James teaching her to shoot, his hands steady over hers, the weight of the gun in her palm as she faced Tate's advancing form. The deafening report as she pulled the trigger. The sudden, terrible stillness that followed. Martha withdrew her hand and nodded once, resolute. "Do it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the dripping water. Ethan held the gun over the shaft, then paused, his expression troubled in the lantern light. "Martha," he said softly, her name still new on his lips. "Before I do this, I need to ask. The man this was used on, did he deserve what happened to him?" It wasn't an accusation or judgment, just a simple question asked by someone who needed to be certain he was aiding justice, not abetting a cold-blooded murder. Martha met his gaze steadily, grateful for the question rather than offended by it. In a world where so many took what they wanted without consequence, Ethan Blackwood still cared about right and wrong, even while helping to conceal a killing. "He came to my home demanding payment for a non-existent debt," Martha replied quietly, her voice gaining strength as she spoke the truth aloud for the first time. "When I refused, he tried to force himself on me, said a woman alone had other ways to pay." Her hand clenched involuntarily at the memory of Tate's meaty fingers grabbing at her waist, the stink of whiskey on his breath as he pushed her against the wall. "I reached for James's gun and warned him to leave. He laughed, said no one would believe a woman over him anyway. When he lunged again, I fired." She took a deep breath, meeting Ethan's eyes without shame or regret. "So yes, Mr. Blackwood, I believe he got exactly what he deserved." Satisfaction and understanding passed across Ethan's features, visible even in the dim lantern light. Without another word, he opened his hand and let the revolver fall. They both listened as it tumbled down the shaft, metal striking rock in a series of diminishing clangs, before a distant splash marked its final resting place in the flooded depths below. Martha felt a curious lightness overtake her, as if a physical weight had been lifted from her shoulders along with the burden of her secret. She looked at Ethan, finding him already watching her with an expression that mingled relief and something warmer, more personal than the practical alliance that had brought them to this moment. They exited the mine in silence, the cool night air a welcome relief after the close confines of the tunnel. The sky had cleared completely. Stars scattered across the darkness in brilliant profusion, the kind of vista that had first made Martha fall in love with this wild territory despite its dangers and hardships. Standing beside their horses, neither seemed eager to part ways now that their task was complete. The shared secret had created a bond between them, an intimacy born of mutual vulnerability and trust that felt surprisingly natural despite their brief acquaintance. Ethan was the first to break the silence, his voice gentle in the quiet night. "What will you do now?" he asked, adjusting his horse's bridle without looking directly at her. "Will you stay in Promise Creek?" The question carried more weight than its simple words suggested. He was asking about her future, whether she intended to continue facing the challenges of frontier life alone, or perhaps consider other possibilities. Martha considered her answer carefully, feeling as if she stood at a crossroads, the path ahead suddenly less certain than it had appeared that morning. Her cabin would always carry the shadow of what had happened there, yet it was still her home, built by James's hands, maintained by her own. Could she simply abandon it and start over elsewhere? "It's my home," she replied finally, the words both an answer and a question in themselves. "I've worked too hard to keep it to just walk away, and who knows what the next owner might find if they decided to plant a garden out back." The attempt at dark humor fell flat, but Ethan nodded understanding nonetheless. He seemed about to speak again when a distant sound caught both their attention. The rhythmic pounding of hoofbeats approaching from the direction of Promise Creek, still far off, but clearly headed their way. Martha felt fear grip her heart once more. Who would be riding in this direction at this hour, and with such urgency? Ethan reacted instantly, extinguishing the lantern and leading both horses deeper into the shadows of the mine entrance. "Could be anyone," he whispered, though his hand had moved instinctively to rest on his holstered revolver. "Prospectors sometimes camp near here. Or it could be someone following our trail." The latter possibility hung between them, unspoken acknowledgement that their actions may not have gone as unnoticed as they'd hoped. They waited in tense silence as the rider drew closer, the sound echoing through the hills until it was nearly upon them. Martha held her breath as a shadowy figure on horseback appeared on the trail below, the rider's features indistinguishable in the darkness. The rider slowed, then stopped directly below their position, scanning the hillside as if searching for something or someone. Martha felt Ethan tense beside her, his body coiled with readiness as they watched the mysterious figure from their concealed position. Then, unexpectedly, the rider called out in a familiar voice that sent a shock of recognition through Martha. "Hello, the mine! Mrs. Wilson, Blackwood, I know you're up there." It was Sheriff Mills, his tone carrying no anger but a definite urgency that suggested whatever had brought him out at this hour was serious indeed. Martha and Ethan exchanged a startled glance, silently debating their response. "No point hiding," Ethan murmured after a moment's consideration. "If he tracked us this far, he knows what he's doing. Better to face him directly and find out what he wants." Martha nodded reluctant agreement, her throat dry with renewed fear. Together they emerged from the shadows, leading their horses down the slope to where Sheriff Mills waited, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. As they approached, Martha noticed the sheriff's right hand resting near his holster, though he made no move to draw his weapon. The gesture was precautionary rather than threatening, but it heightened her awareness of how suspicious their nighttime excursion must appear. "Evening, Sheriff," Ethan greeted calmly, as if there was nothing unusual about being discovered at an abandoned mine in the middle of the night. "Bit late for a social call." The casual tone didn't quite mask the wariness beneath, the readiness to react if the situation turned dangerous. Martha remained silent beside him, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain both men must hear it. Sheriff Mills studied them both before responding, his gaze lingering on Martha with what might have been concern rather than suspicion. Finally, he sighed heavily, removing his hat to wipe his brow despite the cool night air. Two of Tate's friends rode into town an hour ago, Mills said without preamble. Mean-looking pair. Been asking questions about his whereabouts, saying he was supposed to meet them 3 days ago. The sheriff's eyes moved from Martha to Ethan and back again, assessment clear in his gaze. They mentioned he'd talked about visiting a widow east of town, said he was owed money. Martha felt her blood turn to ice, aware of Ethan shifting slightly closer to her, a subtle movement of protection that wasn't lost on the sheriff. I told them I hadn't seen Tate in days and that harassing respectable women in my jurisdiction wasn't tolerated. Suggested they move on. He paused, then added significantly, "They didn't take the suggestion." Martha found her voice at last, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Why are you telling us this, Sheriff?" The question was direct, cutting through pretense to the heart of the matter. If Mills suspected what had happened to Tate, was this his way of making an arrest? Or was there another purpose to his late-night tracking of their movements? The sheriff replaced his hat, adjusting it with deliberate care before answering. His next words changed everything Martha thought she understood about the situation and the man before her. Because Randall Tate assaulted 3 women in Laramie before coming here, Mills replied quietly. Eat one of them so badly she lost an eye. Authorities there have a warrant for his arrest, but he skipped town before they could serve it. He fixed Martha with a knowing look that held no accusation, only a grim understanding. If something happened to him recently, I'd consider it a matter of frontier justice rather than a crime needing investigation. But his friends aren't likely to see it that way. They're staying at the saloon tonight, planning to ride out to visit you tomorrow, Mrs. Wilson. Said they wanted to discuss their friend's business with you. The threat was unmistakable, and Martha felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. These men weren't coming for justice or even revenge. They were coming to continue what Tate had started, using his disappearance as an excuse to target a woman living alone. She glanced at Ethan, finding his expression hardened into dangerous resolve, his hand now resting openly on his holster. The sheriff noticed too, nodding slightly as if confirming something to himself. That's why I came looking for you, both, Mills continued. Figured you might have come out this way, given the interest Blackwood here showed in the old mine during our talk this morning. And now that you found us, Ethan asked carefully, his tone revealing nothing of his thoughts. The sheriff straightened in his saddle, authority and purpose evident in his bearing, despite the unusual circumstances. When he spoke again, it was with the clear, measured cadence of a man outlining an official position, one that Martha realized with growing astonishment was designed to protect her rather than condemn her. Now I'm going to ride back to town and report that I found no sign of Randall Tate anywhere in my jurisdiction, Mills stated firmly. I'm also going to inform his friends that any disturbance at Mrs. Wilson's property will be met with the full force of the law. His gaze shifted between them, conveying the seriousness of his next words, and I'm going to suggest unofficially that it might be wise for Mrs. Wilson not to be alone at her cabin tomorrow when those men come looking, warrant or no warrant. He paused, then added with pointed emphasis, perhaps Mr. Blackwood, with his particular skills, might wish to keep her company for a day or two. Martha stared at the sheriff in stunned silence, understanding slowly dawning. Mills knew, or strongly suspected, what had happened to Tate, and not only was he declining to investigate, he was actively working to protect her from the consequences. Moreover, he was explicitly suggesting that Ethan stay at her cabin as protection against Tate's friends, a proposal that would have been scandalously improper under normal circumstances. The sheriff was bending not just the law but social convention to ensure her safety, revealing a depth of character and compassion that Martha hadn't fully appreciated until this moment. "I'd be happy to offer Mrs. Wilson my protection for as long as necessary," Ethan replied, the formal words at odds with the warmth that had entered his voice. "As a matter of neighborly assistance, of course." Sheriff Mills nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression despite the gravity of the situation. He gathered his reins, preparing to depart, but paused to deliver one final piece of information that completed Martha's understanding of the night's extraordinary events. "Almost forgot to mention," Mills said casually. "Mr. Blackwood here introduced himself to me as a former Texas Ranger this morning. Said he was looking to settle somewhere quieter after years of chasing outlaws." The sheriff's eyes twinkled slightly in the moonlight. "Seems Promise Creek might suit him if the right incentives were in place to encourage him to stay." With that cryptic remark and a tip of his hat, Mills turned his horse and rode back toward town, leaving Martha and Ethan alone once more in the shadow of the mine. Their shared secret now tacitly protected by the very law Martha had feared would condemn her. They watched until the sheriff disappeared into the darkness, neither speaking until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely. When Martha finally turned to Ethan, she found him already looking at her, his expression a complex mixture of relief, admiration, and something deeper that made her breath catch. "A Texas Ranger?" she asked softly, the question encompassing all the things she had yet to learn about this man, who had appeared so unexpectedly in her life and changed its course so dramatically in the space of 2 days. Ethan nodded, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he stepped closer, close enough that Martha could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool night air. "Former Ranger," he corrected gently, "looking for somewhere to belong, somewhere worth protecting." His eyes held hers, the meaning behind his words unmistakable. Martha felt a flutter of something she had thought long buried: hope, possibility, the promise of a future different from the lonely existence she had resigned herself to after James's death. Ethan reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and brushed a strand of hair from her face with a tenderness that spoke volumes about his intentions. "I meant what I said to Mills. I'd be honored to offer you my protection, Martha, for as long as you want it." The invitation hung between them, fraught with meaning beyond the immediate danger posed by Tate's friends. Martha knew that accepting meant more than just temporary safety. It meant opening herself to possibilities she had long since abandoned, risking her heart again after years of careful isolation. Yet standing here with this man who had helped bury her darkest secret without judgment, who understood the harsh realities of frontier justice because he had faced them himself, Martha found the decision surprisingly easy. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them, and did what had seemed unimaginable just days before. She kissed him. A simple gesture at first, a press of lips that conveyed gratitude and nascent affection. But it deepened quickly into something more urgent, more honest about the connection that had formed between them through shared danger and mutual understanding. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Martha found herself smiling genuinely for what felt like the first time in years. "I believe I could use your protection, Mr. Blackwood," she said softly, her voice steadier than she expected. "And perhaps you could use a place to belong." Ethan's answering smile was like sunrise breaking over the eastern hills. Warm, full of promise, the beginning of something new, rather than an ending. As they mounted their horses for the ride back to Martha's cabin, now their cabin, at least for the foreseeable future, Martha cast one last glance at the dark entrance to the mine where the evidence of her past now lay hidden forever. The gun was gone, but its purpose had been served. It had protected her when she needed it most, just as James had intended. Now, somehow, it had also led her to a new protector, a new beginning. Martha turned away from the mine and toward Ethan, who waited patiently, his silhouette strong and reassuring against the star-filled sky. Together they rode into the night, leaving behind buried secrets and facing whatever tomorrow might bring. Not alone, but side by side. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.